Hello everybody, welcome again to today's lecture. As it says here, today we are going to be looking at the Vietnam War, and this is going to be really just a general overview of the conflict. I am not going to get into any detail with respects to the tactics and strategies used. There will be a couple of offensives that we will take a look at, but this is a general overview of why we got involved in the war and how the war was perceived on the home front. And we'll take a look at revolts and rebellions against the war. We'll take a look briefly at the counterculture or the hippies. Okay, but overall this is going to just be a generalized overview, just to give you a sense of what the war was about. Because I think in many ways the Vietnam War is a highly misunderstood war. It is the last major conflict that the United States has been in that lasted a significant period of time. This, of course, could be eclipsed by the War on Terror, but that, in many ways, is more of a current event than a historical one, in that, we're still dealing with the ramifications of that, and in some respects, we're still dealing with the Vietnam War too. But there's just been more distance between us and the Vietnam War. Now, the American phase in Vietnam really begins in the 50s, and then really in 1963, you're really going to see the United States increase the number of troops that are in Vietnam. But you can see here that I have the date as 1945, and the reason I do that is because the conflict in Vietnam began long before the United States got physically involved. It actually begins with Harry Truman's presidency. Events in Vietnam begin to unravel, and so that's why we're going to begin there. Now, the United States ends its participation in the Vietnam War in 1973, but the war itself does not come to an official end until 1975, when North Vietnam invades South Vietnam. The capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, will fall, and the communists will run over Vietnam, and that occurs in 1975. So that's a brief introduction. Now, one of the things I do want to begin with is posing the question, did the United States win the Vietnam War? And many historians simply respond to that with the answer no. And I want to begin this by reading a couple of paragraphs to you from a book called America's Lost War, Vietnam, 1945-1975, by Charles E. New. And he writes this. He says, "The American phase of the Vietnam War, which lasted for 21 years, from 1954 to 1975, was a long and bloody one. More than 58,000 Americans lost their lives, and another 153,000 were wounded. But American losses pale in comparison to those suffered by the Vietnamese." He says, "Perhaps as many as 4 million North and South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians lost their lives, which was roughly 10% of the entire population. Any traveler in Vietnam today is struck by the countless number of cemeteries and war memorials, a grim, silent testament to the length and violence of the struggle." Now, I will say, and I'm digressing a bit here, that the Vietnam War is much like the North Korean conflict, right? This was bred out of America's containment policy. There was a threat of communist subversion, and so we had to go in and we had to stop that or contain that communist spread as we saw it spreading. Okay, it says, "Americans," and this is back to reading, "Americans are not accustomed to failure, and ever since the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, they have tried to understand how the United States and its South Vietnamese allies suffered such a humiliating defeat. On many levels and in many different ways, the process of coming to terms with the Vietnam War continues to unfold. Veterans who fought are still trying to understand what happened to them. Policymakers who escalated the U.S. involvement in the war are still trying to explain their miscalculations." He concludes by saying, from the American perspective, the central question is why the nation fought so long and so hard in such a distant place, and why, in the end, it left communist revolutionaries to overrun South Vietnam. And that's a very difficult question to answer, and unfortunately I have no decent answer for that. Okay, and really what I submit to you is, as you go through this week and as you go through your readings, see what your own opinions are about that. How would you answer those questions and address those issues that historians have to deal with? Okay, all right, with all that said, let's dive right into the conflict itself. How does this thing begin? All right, the roots of the Vietnam War begin with French colonialization. In fact, Vietnam has been a nation, in many ways, a small country that has repeatedly kicked out foreign invaders. Time and time and time again, Vietnam has been infiltrated by stronger foreign powers, and they have invariably and inevitably been able to kick those powers out. The French, for example, will be one, and the United States will be another. But the Vietnam conflict begins and is rooted in French colonialism. It says here, in the late 19th century, Vietnam became a French colony. It says, however, the French took over Vietnam in stages. It says in 1859 they captured Saigon, and Saigon will become the capital of South Vietnam eventually. It says finally in 1883 North and Central Vietnam was forced to become a French protectorate. Now, when the French infiltrate the Vietnamese, when they infiltrate Vietnam, rather, they begin to develop infrastructure. They build roads, they build highways, right? Because as is true with any colony, the colony is intended to benefit the mother country or the fatherland. And in this case, right, Vietnam is controlled and being colonized by the French, and so, you know, the French are going to undertake an infrastructural development process, and this is going to be something that is difficult for them, and by them I mean the Vietnamese, because they are going to be the ones in large part, they're going to have to build these infrastructures, and they're going to have to pay for them via taxes and other ways, right? And so in many respects, what we see with the French is there's already a significant amount of animosity that is held between the Vietnamese and the French by the time that the Vietnam War begins to escalate. Okay? All right, let's move on. It says this building campaign, however, was funded by heavy taxation, which was what I had just mentioned. It says naturally the Vietnamese wanted independence. And the thing that you have to understand about the Vietnam War is that the Vietnam War, much like the Korean conflict, was a war for independence. It was a war in which certain factions of Vietnamese, specifically those under Ho Chi Minh, wanted to reunite Vietnam under one name, the Vietnam name, right? It's not supposed to be Vietnam, the French colony, right? It's supposed to be Vietnam. The problem, at least for the United States, was that the person who was seeking to reunite and gain Vietnamese independence was a communist. Now, originally he wasn't communistic, but he found an ally in the Soviet Union, and that sort of lends Ho Chi Minh to sort of becoming more in tune with communism, okay? But that's what the Vietnam War originally was about. You know, when you take a look at the way that the Vietnam War begins, it begins as a struggle between Vietnam and the French. Much in the way that, you know, we could say, you know, look at the American Revolution. It was the Americans versus the British in order to seek their independence, right? That's sort of what's going on here, okay? So just think about it in those types of terms. All right, I digress. Let's get back to the PowerPoint. It goes on to state here that naturally the Vietnamese wanted independence, and the communists spearheaded the struggle for independence. And eventually the communists will be led by a man by the name of Ho Chi Minh, okay? And in 1925, Ho Chi Minh founded the Revolutionary Youth League, which he did from China. And in 1930, the Revolutionary Youth League became the Vietnamese Communist Party. And it is under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, it is under his power that the move towards independence is going to occur. Now, interestingly, Ho Chi Minh, and I think I will mention this again later, Ho Chi Minh will actually seek aid from the United States, which he will not get. And I'll explain in a little bit why he does that and why he thinks he would gain that aid, okay? But I don't want to get too far ahead. But at this point, what you should be putting together here is that the roots of tension that will lead to the Vietnam War has to do in large respects with the fact that Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese want independence from the French, okay? All right, let's move on. Now, things get stirred up a little bit during World War II, and what essentially happens is Vietnam gets captured by the Japanese, and the Japanese come in, but the problem that occurs here is that once the war is over, a power vacuum is going to be put into place. And rather, I should say it's not put into place, the power vacuum is created because the Japanese are ousted from Vietnam, and it's not quite clear who is going to control Vietnam? Will it be Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese, or will the French attempt to reassert their colonial powers over the French, right? And so that's sort of the root of what's going to start, or rather I should say the catalyst, not the root. That's sort of the catalyst which sort of begins the Vietnam War. Because the Japanese come in, it upsets the power structure in Vietnam. It says, during World War II, Japan invaded and occupied Vietnam, and because the French had been defeated by the Nazis, which if you remember back to World War II, the French had been overrun by the Nazis very quickly. It says, and because the French had been defeated by the Nazis, Japan decided to take advantage of French weakness, and they forced the French government to allow Japanese troops to occupy French Indochina, which is Vietnam, although they left the French administration in place. Okay, moving forward. It goes on to say here that the Vietnamese communists, or what we would call the Viet Minh, okay, and you need to be aware of these names because there's two terms you're going to hear. One is Viet Minh. Those are Vietnamese communists, most of whom were relegated in the north part of Vietnam. And then there's also Viet Cong, or what some people refer to as VC. And the Viet Cong were Vietnamese communists who resided in the south part of Vietnam. But it says here that the Vietnamese communists, or Viet Minh, fought the Japanese during World War II, and by 1945, the Viet Minh controlled parts of North Vietnam. And this is why North Vietnam becomes communistic in a way that South Vietnam originally did not. It's because the Viet Minh took control over that region of Vietnam during World War II. It says, meanwhile, in March 1945, the Japanese took control of the administration of Vietnam, but when Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, they left this power vacuum. Now remember, the Japanese had kept the French administration in place. And so basically what you have once the Japanese are gone is a strong presence of Vietnamese communists under Ho Chi Minh in the north, and you sort of have this continued French presence. And once the war is over, the French are going to attempt to re-exert their control over Vietnam, and that's going to butt heads with these Vietnamese nationalists, these revolutionaries who want to reunite Vietnam as an independent nation. Okay? So Ho Chi Minh comes in to fill the vacuum that existed once the Japanese left. He called for an uprising called the August Revolution, and the Viet Minh, also referred to as the League for the Independence of Vietnam, they took control over most of Vietnam. Okay? And so when that happens, when Ho Chi Minh controls almost all of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh is going to declare Vietnam an independent sovereign nation. Okay? Now once that happens, the French begin to re-exert their control over Vietnam. Let me read to you from a book called America, A Narrative History. It says, Ho's Declaration of Vietnamese Independence, borrowed from Thomas Jefferson, opening with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Ho Chi Minh had secretly received American help against the Japanese during World War II, which makes sense, right? Because Japan is our enemy, and Ho Chi Minh was fighting the Japanese during World War II, and so we're going to extend them services and extend them aid, much in the same way that we extended aid to the Soviet Union. But as we saw in last week's or in previous lectures during the Cold War, our once ally turned enemy now, right? And Ho Chi Minh's going to find that that's going to be the same thing. It says, Ho had secretly received American help against the Japanese during the war, but his bid for additional aid after World War II went unanswered. Many times Ho Chi Minh had wrote letters to the United States government petitioning help to fight against the encroachment of the French, right? He had declared Vietnam an independent nation, and he saw the French as a threat, and he's asking the United States for help, okay? Time and time again he writes these letters, and time again his letters are ignored, right? It says, Vietnam was a low priority in U.S. diplomatic concern at the time, and Truman could not stomach aiding a professed communist. And so, once World War II's over, Ho Chi Minh is going to have to figure out a way to fight the French himself. He's not going to get aid from the United States because the United States is not going to supply aid to a communist leader or a communist nation. Instead, what the United States is going to do is it's going to throw its help or its aid, as minimal as it originally was, to the French. It was the hope of the United States that the French would be able to defeat Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. Unfortunately, as history turned out, that's not what happened. Let's keep going. It says, seeking to regain control of the region, France came to support an emperor by the name of Bao Dai. And this is a French-educated Vietnamese individual, right? And Bao Dai was situated in South Vietnam, and the French throw their support behind him. So at this point, you've got the French who have a pseudo-ally in Bao Dai who will help them fight against the Viet Minh in the north. Okay? So it says, seeking to regain control of the area, the French backed the French-educated Emperor Bao Dai and set up the state of Vietnam, which was in South Vietnam. And they did this in July of 1949. And they placed Saigon as the capital. Now, what happens is a number of battles, wars, between the French and the North Vietnamese ensue. And ultimately, in the end, what happens is one decisive battle occurs at a place known as Dien Bien Phu. And this occurs in 1954, May of 1954, and the French are completely destroyed in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. They're defeated by Viet Minh forces. Now, when the French are defeated at Dien Bien Phu, this does not immediately reunite Vietnam. It does not immediately turn Vietnam into a communist nation. What it does is it kicks the French out, and it creates an opportunity for the North Vietnamese to be able to move into South Vietnam, conquer the capital, and ultimately bring communism throughout the nation. And this will eventually happen, but it will happen in 1975. Okay? Now, the United States gets far more involved in 1954 once the French are ousted. Now, this does not mean that in 1954 the United States is sending mass numbers of troops into Vietnam. That's not what's happening. But what we will begin to do is we will begin to send in military advisors, okay, to train the South Vietnamese. We will provide moral support, right? And we will support and back various leaders who will rule in South Vietnam. The problem with many of the rulers, as we will see, who come to control South Vietnam, is that they largely are corrupt and inefficient. Okay? Now, I digress just a bit. Let's get back to the PowerPoint. Once Dien Bien Phu falls, and in fact, once we're done with this PowerPoint slide, please click on the word Dien Bien Phu. It will take you to a video that will cover that particular battle for you. It's an interesting video, so please watch that. But after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, it says there was a treaty that occurred. It says the subsequent treaty negotiations at Geneva decided to address the problem that the Vietnamese were having. And so what they decided to do at Geneva was they said, all right, this is how we're going to solve the Vietnamese problem. We're going to split Vietnam along the latitude known as the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh would take control of the north and communism would be established, and Bao Dai would take control over the south. And the idea here was that by 1956, elections were to be held to reunify all of Vietnam under one type of government. The people would vote, and then Vietnam would be reunified. Well, those elections never happen, okay? It says in 1955, however, the strongly anti-communist Ngo Dinh Diem basically took power. He pushes Bao out of control, and Diem establishes the government of the Republic of Vietnam, and he does this in South Vietnam, okay? So what you have after the Geneva Convention, after the Geneva decision to split Vietnam, instead of having elections to reunify Vietnam in 1956, what happens is North Vietnam remains communistic under Ho Chi Minh, but there's a power struggle. And ultimately, Bao Dai is removed from power and Diem gets put into power. He takes control. Now, Diem becomes an extremely corrupt individual. He refuses to redistribute land to the peasantry as promised. He refuses to allow for the elections to occur. And ultimately, the United States can do very little except hope that Diem will follow through on what he said he was going to do. Now, he never actually does this. Okay? The United States in 1954, 55, 56 is not ready to commit ground troops to the Vietnam struggle. And so that's why when I said all that the United States could do at this point was to sit by and hope that it would all work out in the end and Ho Chi Minh and his communists would not succeed, right? When I say that, I simply mean to say that at this point in time, the United States was not willing to commit troops. They could have committed troops if they had wanted to, but in 56, they're not going to do that just yet, okay? All right, let's move on. It says here that with the Cold War intensifying, the United States hardened its policies against any allies of the Soviet Union. And of course, Ho Chi Minh would have been an ally of the Soviet Union, right? And it goes on to here to state that, and by 1955, President Eisenhower pledged his firm support to Diem and to South Vietnam. Okay? Going back to my book, American Narrative History, it says, Eisenhower announced that though the United States had not itself been party to or bound by the decision taken at the Geneva Conference, and remember the Geneva Conference was that conference which split South Vietnam and North Vietnam along the 17th parallel line. It was the Geneva Conference that allowed for North Vietnam to be controlled under Ho Chi Minh and South Vietnam to be controlled under Bao Dai, and that elections were to be held. Right? None of that happened. It says, Eisenhower said, though we had not been party to or bound by that decision, Eisenhower says, any renewal of communist aggression in Southeast Asia would be viewed by the United States as a matter of grave concern. In other words, Eisenhower says, even though we were not responsible for the Geneva Conference, even though we were not there, we will view communist attempts to overthrow South Vietnam as an aggressive maneuver, and the United States will have to take some type of action. Right? At least that's what Eisenhower's saying. Now, he's not actually sending troops into South Vietnam to ensure that North Vietnam does not become aggressive, but he is making quite clear that the United States has an interest in South Vietnam. And so he's going, and by he I mean the United States under Eisenhower, is going to support Diem. Okay? It goes on here to state that with training and equipment from American military and police, Diem's security forces cracked down on Viet Minh sympathizers in the South, whom Diem derisively called the Viet Cong, or Vietnamese communists, arresting some 100,000 people, many of whom were tortured and executed. Okay? All right, let's move on. It says here that by 1957, the Viet Cong, and again, remember the Viet Cong are Vietnamese communists in the South, part of Vietnam. It says, by 1957, the Viet Cong and other opponents of Diem's repressive regime began fighting back with attacks on government officials and other targets, and by 1959, the Viet Cong had begun engaging South Vietnamese army forces in firefights. And so the military conflict is beginning to escalate in South Vietnam. Diem is incredibly oppressive, and part of the reason why the Viet Cong rise up in the South is because of that oppression. Now again, in 1957, 1959, the United States is still not ready to commit thousands and thousands and thousands of troops into South Vietnam to suppress Viet Cong action. Now, by 1959, we are beginning to send some military advisors into the region. In fact, by the time John F. Kennedy is assassinated in 1963, there will be about 16,000 military advisors in South Vietnam. Okay? But what we have to understand with the Vietnam conflict at this point is that this is a civil conflict. This is a civil war by 1959. This is a conflict over what direction Vietnam and the Vietnamese are going to go. And because the United States was committed to containing communism, they felt it necessary to intervene. Okay? It says in December 1960, Diem's opponents within South Vietnam, both communists and non-communists, formed the National Liberation Front to organize resistance to his regime. Okay? In other words, the individual that the United States is hoping will solve the issues, the individual that the United States has supported throughout this whole ordeal, is beginning to lose support. by both communists and non-communists. Okay? All right, move on. It says, though the NLF claimed to be autonomous and that most of its members were non-communist, many in Washington assumed it was a puppet of Hanoi, Hanoi being a communist capital. It says, a team sent by President Kennedy in 1961 to report on conditions in South Vietnam advised a buildup of American military, economic, and technical aid in order to help confront the Viet Cong threat. In other words, by 1961, the administration in the United States is beginning to recognize that the situation in South Vietnam and in North Vietnam is growing far more perilous than perhaps they thought, and diplomacy isn't working. Hoping DM will rectify the situation isn't working, and so, of course, Kennedy is being advised we need to have more of a presence here if we're going to contain any communist threat. It says, working under the domino theory, Kennedy increased U.S. aid, though he stopped short of committing to a large-scale military intervention. It says, by 1962, the U.S. military presence in South Vietnam had reached some 9,000 troops, compared with fewer than 800 during the 1950s. Again, by 1963, that number will have increased from 9,000 to 16,000, and then under Lyndon Johnson, who will take the presidency after Kennedy was assassinated, he will increase the number of troops from 16,000 in 1963 to over 500,000 by 1970. Okay. Going back to my book, it says, by 1963, Kennedy was receiving sharply divergent reports from the South Vietnamese countryside. American military advisors expressed confidence in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. On-site political reporters, however, watching the reactions of the Vietnamese people, predicted civil turmoil as long as DM remained in power. By mid-year, growing Buddhist demonstrations against DM ignited the discontent in the South. The spectacle of Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire in protest against government tyranny stunned Americans. By the fall of 1963, the Kennedy administration had decided that the autocratic DM had to be done away with. When dissident generals proposed a coup d'etat, the U.S. ambassador assured them that America would not stand in the way. In other words, by 1963, by the fall of 1963, DM's regime has become so oppressive that essentially dissident generals of DM's regime have decided that they're going to kill him. They tell the United States that they are planning on doing this, and the United States simply says, that's fine, we won't intervene. It says on November 1st, they seized the South Vietnamese government and murdered DM. But the rebel generals provided no more stability than had earlier regimes, and successive coups set the fragile country spinning from one military leader to another. And thus, by 1963-1964, the situation in Vietnam had changed drastically than what it had been in the 1940s and 1950s. And under Lyndon Baines Johnson, the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War will become monumental. And it is that portion of the Vietnam conflict that most Americans remember. It is that period from about 1963-64 up until 1973 that is probably the most divisive decade of the Vietnam War. Okay, but as we have seen here, the Vietnam War did not begin in 1963 or 1964. There had been issues going on in that region for many, many years. Okay, and again, one of the things you can definitely go back and do as you watched during the Cold War lectures, you can go back to that film on John Green where he talks about the Cold War in Asia, and look at what he has to say about the Vietnam War. Okay. All right, let's move forward. It says here that Kennedy's assassination was a turning point for the Vietnam War, as his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, would escalate the conflict, increasing the total number of troops from 16,000, where it stood when Kennedy was killed, to over 500,000 by 1970. And this Johnson does by implementing a draft, right? And the draft itself is an incredibly controversial way to go about fighting a war that for many soldiers they had no idea why they were even there, right? Protesters at home and soldiers alike both were confused at what the purpose was behind fighting the war in Vietnam, right? Okay. It says the ensuing political instability in South Vietnam persuaded Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to further increase U.S. military and economic support. Okay. Now, there is a film here on Kennedy's assassination. I'd encourage you to go ahead and watch that. It's a short film which talks briefly about that assassination. I'm not so concerned about the assassination itself, but I am concerned with the fact that with Kennedy being gone from the White House, Johnson now had the opportunity to increase the war in Vietnam. Kennedy was on the fence about escalating troop involvement in Vietnam. Johnson seems to not have been that way. Okay, it's not exactly clear why he chose to do that, but we do know that containment was a significant aspect of it. That Johnson was committed to containment, and so he increased the number of troops in South Vietnam. Okay, so go ahead and click on that video, watch that, and then move on to the next slide. Okay, so Johnson is now in the White House, and as already mentioned, he will escalate the number of troops into Vietnam. Now, the question is, how does he go about doing that, right? Johnson has to have some type of rationalization for increasing the number of troops, right? And he's going to get that, okay? Or he will make it up, as we will come to find out. It says here that the following August, after DRV torpedo boats attacked 2 U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, Johnson ordered the retaliatory bombing of military targets in North Vietnam. Congress soon passed something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is really the thing that allowed for Johnson to increase America's involvement in Vietnam. What did the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution do? It gave Johnson basically a blank check. It gave him broad war-making powers. Okay? And U.S. planes began regular bombing raids, oftentimes on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a supply line from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. This was codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder, and that began the following February. Now, the Vietnam War was never actually declared a war by Congress. Okay, so it's not really fair to call it a war, at least not on behalf of the United States, because we never declared war against Vietnam. What it was a military action against the Vietnamese, and the catalyst for the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was this supposed destruction of American ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Okay? It says here in my book, the official sanction for military escalation in Southeast Asia, a Defense Department term favored during the Vietnam era, was the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, voted by Congress on August 7th, 1964, after merely 30 minutes of discussion. On that day, Johnson told a national television audience that 2 destroyers, the USS Maddox and the USS C. Turner Joy, had been attacked by North Vietnamese vessels on August 2nd and 4th in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. Johnson described the attack, called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, as unprovoked. Now, the reality is that it was provoked. The reality is that those ships were there doing reconnaissance missions, and they were placed there by the United States. Okay? The whole situation was manufactured to a degree. It was not completely honest, and the truth of the matter is that the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was based upon information that wasn't quite accurate. Okay? It says the Tonkin Gulf Resolution authorized the president to take, quote, all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. Okay? Now, what the Tonkin Gulf Resolution does is it basically gives Johnson a war that he can fight without, in fact, Congress having actually declared a war. And this is really what allows for those 16,000 military troops to increase to over 500,000. Moving on. It says, in March 1965, Johnson made the decision, with solid support from the American public, to send U.S. combat forces into battle in Vietnam. Now, the difficult thing about the Vietnam War is that this is a very unconventional war, okay? You did not necessarily know who your enemy was. Oftentimes, the way that this war was fought was basically you'd go into various villages and just kill everybody that was in the village, right? In fact, we're going to hear about one of these incidents known as the My Lai Massacre, where civilians and others alike were killed because you simply could not identify who the enemy was, and so you did unto them before they did unto you. We are also fighting in a region that is largely jungle, okay? The terrain is unfamiliar. Oftentimes you'd have groups of men who would get cut off from the rest of their regiments or platoons, right? And it was a conflict that was really outside of America's control, and the way that they chose to fight it was not in a way to win the war, right? I mean, we could have easily dropped bombs and just obliterated Vietnam if we had wanted to, but doing that would have caused both China and the Soviet Union to probably start World War III, and so you don't go in there with guns blaring and just completely wipe North Vietnam off the map, okay? And so it's being fought in a very unconventional way, and ultimately, from 1965 onward, people begin to ask the question, why are we fighting? What is all this about, okay? It says, by June 1965, 82,000 combat troops were stationed in Vietnam, and General William Westmoreland was calling for 175,000 more by the end of 1965 to shore up the struggling South Vietnamese army. Despite the concerns of some of his advisors about this escalation and about the entire war effort, as well as a growing anti-war movement in the United States, Johnson authorized the immediate dispatch of 100,000 troops at the end of July 1965 and another 100,000 in 1966. So despite the fact that this eventually becomes a very unpopular move, Johnson does it anyways. It says that in addition to the United States, South Korea, Thailand, Australia, and New Zealand also committed troops to fight in South Vietnam, albeit these other nations did so on a much smaller scale. So ultimately, by 1965, the involvement of American troops in Vietnam is going to escalate exponentially, and it will be led by one General William Westmoreland, who you will see in a video later on. Who you will see later in a video later on. Okay, let's move forward. Okay, it says, in contrast to the air attacks on North Vietnam, which is how we began, right? It says, in contrast to the air attacks on North Vietnam, the U.S. and South Vietnamese war effort in the South was fought on the ground, largely under the command again of Westmoreland, in coordination with the government of General Nguyen Van Thieu in Saigon. It says, in general, U.S. military forces in the region pursued a policy of attrition. Now, a policy of attrition is one in which you kill about as many people as you can, right? It's not that you take over their capital. It's not that you try to take over large tracts of land, right? It's that you kill as many people as possible, right? Now, in the Vietnam War, this was made rather difficult because it was difficult to find your enemy because they had dug these sort of what you might call rat tunnels underneath the ground, and their headquarters and their bases were under the ground. In fact, if you go back to the Blackboard shell, what you will see is a film called The Tunnel Rats. And it will show you and talk a little bit about some of the troops and the way they had to go in and actually crawl through these various tunnels with a gun in their hand trying to find the enemy to clear out the tunnels. I mean, it was difficult to fight this war on the ground. Okay? So it says, in general, U.S. military forces in the region pursued a policy of attrition, aiming to kill as many enemy troops as possible rather than trying to secure territory. But again, when you cannot find the enemy or you cannot identify the enemy, you have to resort to tactics that might seem completely horrific, such as killing civilians and wiping out entire villages, right? And I will also make quite plain and clear here that one of the things that occurred in Vietnam, and if you're interested in this topic, I have someone I can send you to who knows way more about it, but oftentimes one of the ways that violence was used against the Vietnamese, and specifically Vietnamese women, was through the use of rape and sexual violence. There is accounts of multiple women who were kidnapped and taken and gang raped and murdered. Okay, and that's a whole lecture in and of itself. But understand that it became standard procedure, standard operation procedure. No one, batted an eye at men raping women. It's kind of like, it's the spoil of war, right? You dehumanize these people. There's a whole discourse surrounding why one would be willing and accepting of this type of behavior, but do recognize that the Vietnam War excuse me guys, I just sneezed there, sorry. But the Vietnam War was fought with more than just guns, right? It was fought with sexual violence. In fact, there's a film, it was a Hollywood film based upon a true story, where Sean Penn, the actor, is talking to Michael J. Fox, the other actor, and they're about to gang rape a woman, and Michael J. Fox's character doesn't want to do it, and he's holding a gun against Sean Penn's character, and Sean Penn says to Michael J. Fox, you're carrying a gun. The government calls that a weapon, but that's not a weapon. Instead, what Sean Penn does is he grabs his penis and he says, this is a weapon. And they go off, and this is again based on a true story, and 4 men gang rape this poor woman and then murder her. Okay, so the Vietnam War is fought in a quasi unconventional way. Okay, now this is not to say that sexual violence was novel to the Vietnam War. It definitely wasn't, but it was something that we do have to understand was going on. Okay, so I digress a bit, but if that's a topic that interests you, please let me know. Okay, back to the PowerPoint here. It says by 1966, large areas of South Vietnam had been designated as free fire zones, from which all innocent civilians were supposed to have evacuated and only enemy remained. The problem with that, of course, is that there were many civilians who were still in those regions. This is why many Vietnam veterans were considered baby killers or civilian killers, because they were ordered to eradicate villages where supposedly only the enemy was. But the truth of the matter is that there were civilians there, and there were many times when civilians were specifically targeted. Okay, again, a very unconventional type of war. All right, moving on. It says here that heavy bombing by B-52 aircraft or shelling made these zones uninhabitable, as refugees poured into camps in designated safe areas near Saigon and other cities. It says even as the body count, at times exaggerated by the United States and South Vietnamese authorities, so even as the body count mounted steadily, DRV and Viet Cong troops refused to stop fighting, encouraged by the fact that they could easily reoccupy lost territory. It says, meanwhile, supported by aid from China and the Soviet Union, North Vietnam strengthened its own air defenses. Okay, so the United States is fighting an uphill battle, and they have to play by a different set of rules than they otherwise would have, because you do not want to bring Soviet Union and Chinese troops into North Vietnam and start a much larger war, right? So we are fighting the Vietnam War in a slightly different way. A way to win it, but not in the conventional way to win it, right? Because we are not seeking to destroy communism, we're seeking to contain it. All right, moving on. It says that by November 1967, the number of American troops in Vietnam was approaching 500,000, and U.S. casualties had reached 15,058 killed and 109,527 wounded. As the war stretched on, some soldiers came to mistrust their government's reasons for keeping them there, as well as Washington's claims that the war was being won. And in fact, the soldiers were not the only ones who came to distrust the government. Many within the American home front came to revolt and rebel and protest against the Vietnam War. It was an extremely unpopular conflict. It says the later years of the war actually saw increased physical and psychological deterioration among American soldiers, including drug use, mutinies, and attacks by soldiers against officers and non-commissioned officers. Okay, in other words, by the time that the war starts to slow down by 1972-73, soldiers begin to really rebel against being in Vietnam. There's a lot of psychological trauma that's gone on. In fact, there's a lot of physical trauma that went on that was created by the United States. One of the ways that the United States had to fight the Vietnam War was they had to clear out mass amounts of jungle. And the way that they did this was they dropped various chemicals upon the jungle, when the troops may well have been underneath that. They're dropping things like napalm, which is flammable, and Agent Orange, as a way to clear out the brush and clear out the trees. Well, these types of chemicals have long-lasting physical ramifications that Vietnam veterans are still dealing with today. Definitely something you might want to take a look into is this Agent Orange and napalm and the use of those two herbicides during the Vietnam War. Okay? All right, moving on. Okay, one of the things that I do need to mention about the Vietnam War was that this war was in many ways broadcasted on national television. It became known as the Living Room War. It was a war that people could sit down and they could see on the nightly news what was going on. Now, this actually didn't work out well for the United States government because the government was oftentimes telling Americans that the war was going well and the U.S. was winning. Well, news reports and journalists were telling a very different story. And it says here that bombarded by horrific images of the war on their televisions, Americans on the home front turned against the war as well. And when I say as well, I mean in addition to the soldiers who are in country in Vietnam, Americans themselves become protesting against the war. It says in October 1967, some 35,000 demonstrators stage a mass anti-war protest outside the Pentagon. Opponents of the war argued that civilians, not enemy combatants, were the primary victims, and that the United States was supporting a corrupt dictatorship in Saigon. And, some of these claims were not untrue. And as I will mention again later, the My Lai massacre proved that civilians were being targeted, and that it's not just enemy combatants who are being killed, right? But again, this is evidence of the complications of fighting a war like Vietnam. Okay. Further war protests. It says on October 21st, 1967, one of the most prominent anti-war demonstrations took place as some 100,000 protesters gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. Around 30,000 of them continued in a march on the Pentagon later that night. After a brutal confrontation with the soldiers and U.S. Marshals protecting the building, hundreds of demonstrators were arrested. Right? It was not uncommon for war protest demonstrators to be arrested, and as we will see, particularly at the Kent State protest, which occurs a little bit later, people were actually killed in those protests. Okay. As a side note, I'm going to be digressing a bit and talking about war protest, and so I'm going to be moving up the timeline a little bit from about 1967 to about 1970-71, just to talk about war protest, and then I'll move back on the timeline and finish our discussion of the war itself. Okay, but this protest here in 1967, this is just one example. It is not the most prominent example of war protest, but it is a example. Yeah, as I just mentioned, I'm going to be moving up on the timeline, and one of the events I want to talk about, the one I want to highlight, is one that actually occurred on April 30th, 1970. By this point, Richard Nixon had become the president. Lyndon Baines Johnson did not want to run for a second term, and that's not surprising. But Nixon, as we will see later in this lecture, when he becomes president, he begins a policy known as Vietnamization, which is the gradual withdrawal of troops from Vietnam, which is a good thing. But at the same time, he opens up a new war in Cambodia, and he begins bombings in Cambodia. And this is going to lead to a major protest, which occurred at Kent State University in Ohio. It says here, later in the war, on April 30th, 1970, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television to announce the invasion of Cambodia by the United States and the need to draft 150,000 more soldiers for an expansion of the Vietnam War effort. This provoked massive protests on campuses throughout the country, and Kent State was one of those particular campuses. It says at Kent State University in Ohio, protesters launched a demonstration that included setting fire to the ROTC building, which prompted the governor of Ohio to dispatch 900 National Guardsmen to the campus. Now, obviously, when you are protesting something, you probably should not be burning down the buildings, right? And for those reasons, I think the protesters were in the wrong. But these 900 National Guardsmen are going to begin to open fire. And they wound many, and they eventually kill 4 Kent State protesters. Now, again, this is a little bit later in the Vietnam War, but what we see at Kent State is sort of similar to other types of protesters that you might see across the United States. Not that people are necessarily being shot down by National Guardsmen, but simply the fact that you have students, many of the protesters were young people, they were students, who simply do not understand why the United States is fighting the war in Vietnam. Okay. Continuing with the Kent State protests, it says, during an altercation on May 4th, 28 guardsmen opened fire on a crowd, killing 4 students and wounding 9. Following the killings, the unrest across the country escalated even further. It says almost 500 colleges were shut down or disrupted by protests. Despite the public outcry, the Justice Department initially declined to conduct a grand jury investigation. A report by the President's Commission on Campus Unrest did acknowledge, however, that the action of the guardsmen had been unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable, and a grand jury did come to indict 8 of the guardsmen, but these charges were ultimately dismissed. Okay? And that, of course, too, is going to make people unhappy, right? As they recognize that people were simply protesting a war that they did not understand, that the government was essentially in many ways lying to them about. And 4 people had to be killed and 9 were wounded in the process. Okay? And this becomes known as the Kent State Massacre, right? The killings at Kent State. Moving on. It says, in their coverage of the events at Kent State, the media used a photo taken by a fellow student of a woman kneeling in anguish, arms upraised beside one of the slain students. The Pulitzer Prize-winning image soon became a symbol of the social upheaval of the time. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to click on the title, War Protest, and then click on Crosby, Still, Nash & Young, and each are going to talk more about this particular event. Specifically, the Crosby, Still, Nash & Young is going to play you a song from Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young that you may have heard before, which the song that they wrote was a response to the Kent State Massacre. You'll hear the words 4 dead in Ohio. This should have been done long ago, talking about the Vietnam War. Okay, so just click on those 2 videos, watch those, and just get a sense of what this was about. You're also going to see a lot of images from the Kent State event, including the one mentioned here. So watch those, think through what these war protests are about, all right, and what they mean. Once you're done with that, move on to the next slide. Okay, just some images of war protest. This is an extremely iconic image, and obviously it's fairly self-explanatory. Here you see protesters sticking flowers into the barrels of MP guns, right? Make peace, make love, not war. Again, not a whole lot I got to say about that. Just wanted to throw this picture up for you. And then the next one. Right? It says here, dead, 48,700 American soldiers, and that number will eventually increase to about 58,000 for American students. And the question is why? Why are they dead? No one knows what's going on. No one can answer this question, right? Now, student protesters were not the only individuals who protested the war in Vietnam. The hippies, also referred to as the members of the counterculture, also heavily protested the war. And in fact, the hippies are the followers, came on the heels of the beatniks. And if you recall our lecture from the 1950s, the beatniks were rebels without a cause. They were rebelling against society, but they weren't. There was no real reason for why they were rebelling. Okay, the counterculture, or the hippies, they were rebelling against society as well, but they actually had something that they could anchor themselves to, and that was the Vietnam War. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to watch this film on the hippies. The film itself is about 20 or so minutes. Okay, and it's going to cover the hippies, and it's going to talk about who they were, what they were about, and I think it's important to understand who the hippies were, because it's not just drugs, sex, and folk music, right? There was a reason behind what they were doing, and we need to try to understand what that reason was. Okay, so go ahead and click on that, watch that, and then move on to the next slide. Okay, now that you have a better understanding of the war protests and hopefully the hippies, let's now get back to the war itself. And a climactic event occurs in 1968, about where we left off. An event known as the Tet Offensive. It says, by the end of 1967, Hanoi's communist leadership was growing impatient, and they wanted to bring this thing to an end. And so what they were going to do is they were going to attack multiple American embassies, multiple American places, in one fell swoop, with the hope of creating one giant punch to the throat, if you will, to end the war. It says, because they grew impatient, they sought to strike a decisive blow aimed at forcing the better supplied United States to give up hopes of their success. Thus, on January 31st, 1968, some 70,000 DRV forces under General Vo Nguyen Giap launched something known as the Tet Offensive. Tet is the name for the Lunar New Year, right? And the Tet Offensive was a coordinated series of fierce attacks on more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. Now, the Tet Offensive was rather a surprise to the Americans and their allies, because on the day of Tet there was supposed to be a truce. It's supposed to be a day where, you know, things start fresh, things start new, right? And so there was an agreement that no fighting would occur on the day of Tet. But of course, the Viet Cong and the Communists attacked these 100 cities and towns in what became known as the Tet Offensive. Now, this was broadcast on national television, and it too caused a lot of war protest, right? But what this was is that basically the United States got caught with its pants down around its ankles, right? We didn't realize or know that this offensive was coming. Now, in the end, they were unsuccessful, right? The Tet Offensive was not successful in bringing a decisive blow, right? But it did cause a lot of war protest. It caused some supporters of the war to begin to question whether or not the war was going well, as the government had said, right? And if you click on this, the term Tet Offensive, it will take you to a news coverage of this, where you will hear General Westmoreland sort of discuss how this was a quasi, success. That because the Tet Offensive was not successful and all the Viet Cong had been killed, it was therefore a success. But the truth of the matter is that it wasn't. This was an offensive that caught the Americans by surprise, and it was not supposed to have happened. They had been planning, and by they I mean the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese communists, had been planning for months, obviously, to plan this attack, and they were using American weapons to do so, right? Important offensive. It's sort of a turning point in the Vietnam War, okay? And, well, there's no and there. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. It was a turning point in the war in many ways, all right? So go ahead and click on that, watch that. I'd say only watch 2 or 3 minutes of it and then move back in, okay? All right, moving forward. Though taken by surprise, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces managed to strike back quickly, and the Communists were unable to hold any of the targets for more than a day or two. Reports of the attacks, however, stunned the U.S. public, especially after news broke that Westmoreland had requested an additional 200,000 troops, right? If you watched the film, Westmoreland sort of talks about how this was a success and the American forces, repelled the invasion at Tet, and that the war was, to a degree, sort of going well. Well, Americans are watching this thinking, this is not going well, and if we were doing what we were supposed to be doing, if in fact we were winning this war, we wouldn't need 200,000 additional troops to fight it, right? At least this is what many people are beginning to feel, okay? It says, with his approval ratings dropping in this election year, Johnson called a halt to bombing in much of North Vietnam in March and promised to dedicate the rest of his term to seeking a peace rather than re-election, which of course he will get neither. He will not become a president for a second term, and unfortunately his diplomatic efforts will fall short because by the time that he does leave the presidency, the war is still waging on, okay? And it will be up to Nixon to have to address the war itself, okay? But the Tet Offensive is one of those iconic times during the Vietnam War when it becomes very apparent that things are not going well, that things are not going the way that the government said that they should have gone, or that they were going. All right, it says Johnson's new plan, laid out in a March 1968 speech, met with a positive response from Hanoi. Again, remember, this is the communist capital. And peace talks between the United States and North Vietnam opened in Paris that May. It says, despite the later inclusion of the South Vietnamese and the National Liberation Front, the dialogue soon reached an impasse, And after an election campaign marred by violence, Republican Richard M. Nixon defeated Herbert Humphrey to win the White House. These talks basically began to further deteriorate. Again, remember, Johnson said, "I will spend the rest of my presidency trying to bring about a peace." That peace doesn't happen. Despite the fact that all the players are coming to the table, the peace doesn't occur, and the war will continue. All right? Let's move on. All right, as president, Nixon sought to deflate the anti-war movement by appealing to a, quote, silent majority of Americans who Nixon believes supported the war effort. And there may have been some people who supported the Vietnam War, but they would have been a small minority. It says, in an attempt to limit the volume of American casualties, Nixon announced a program of withdrawing troops, as well as increasing aerial and artillery bombardment and giving South Vietnamese control over ground operations. That's really one of the things that Nixon wants to do, is he wants to make the South Vietnamese more responsible for their own fight. So we'll withdraw the troops, which he's going to call Vietnamization, right? This is called Vietnamization. And he's going to try and ensure that the South Vietnamese army can fight for themselves better than they had been, okay? So that's known as Vietnamization. It says, in addition to this policy, which again he called Vietnamization, Nixon continued public peace talks in Paris, adding higher-level secret talks conducted by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, which began in the spring of 1968. Now, again, you can see we're already in 1968. The conflict, at least as far as the United States goes, we don't get out of this until 1972. So the process of withdrawing troops, the process of having peace talks, this takes a long time. And remember, the Kent State Massacre, the Kent State protest issue, happened in 1970, 2 years after this period that we're currently talking about, right? So there's a lot of tension that's still to be mounted. There's a lot of work that's still left to be done, okay? Pulling forward. It goes on here to state that the North Vietnamese, however, despite the willingness of the United States to engage in peace talks, it says the North Vietnamese continued to insist on complete U.S. withdrawal as a condition of peace. And the next few years, however, would bring even more carnage, including the horrifying revelation that the United States soldiers had massacred more than 400 unarmed civilians in the My Lai massacre in March of 1968. And I have mentioned this already to you, but let me read a little bit about this here. It says, back on the home front, revelations of suppressed reports of atrocities in Vietnam caused even the staunchest supporters of the war to wince. Late in 1969, the story of the My Lai massacre broke in the press, plunging the country into 2 years of exposure to the gruesome tale of Lieutenant William Calais, who ordered the murder of 347 civilians in the village of My Lai in 1968. 25 Army officers were charged with the complicity in the massacre and subsequent cover-up, but only Calais was convinced, and Nixon later granted him parole. Okay? But this helps to explain, one, why the war is so unpopular and increasingly becomes so unpopular, but also why many Vietnam vets and soldiers who returned home were horrifically hated, called baby killers, right? It's for stories like this where men were ordered to kill civilians. And so even in Nixon's attempt to withdraw troops, even in Nixon's attempt to bring out a peace, right, horrific stories of civilian casualties makes the war look worse. And peace talks are not going well because the United States is not willing to do a complete 100% withdrawal of all troops. And so the North Vietnamese are not willing to bring about a full peace, right? They're not getting their demands had, okay, if you will. So the war, 1968 by 1969, still not going well. Okay, let's move on. It states that anti-war protests continued to build as the conflict wore on. In 1968 and 1969, there were hundreds of anti-war marches and gatherings throughout the country. On November 15th, 1969, the largest anti-war protest in American history took place in D.C. as over 250,000 Americans gathered peacefully, calling for withdrawal. Again, I don't need to harp on this any longer than that. Just understand that through 68-69, the war is becoming increasingly unpopular. All right, let's move on. Further information says that the anti-war movement, which was particularly strong on college campuses, divided Americans bitterly, and I think that that's probably already fairly evident. It says, for some young people, the war symbolized a form of unchecked authority they had come to resent. For other Americans, opposing the government was considered unpatriotic and treasonous, right? And that's an interesting tension because, in many ways, protesting your government is a patriotic thing, right? Thomas Jefferson even said that there needs to be rebellion every 20 years in order to check tyranny. The First Amendment says that you have the right to petition your government for redress. So in fact, you can be acting in a very patriotic sort of way by protesting. But on the other hand, when you question what the government's doing, then that could make you seem like you don't trust your government. And I would suggest that many student protesters and the counterculture didn't trust their government. And it's not hard to understand. They're telling you that the war is going well, and then you see the Tet Offensive, right? You hear that enemy combatants are being killed, and then you hear of My Lai massacre, and civilians are in fact being killed, right? And so it becomes very difficult to believe what you're being told. And there's going to be greater and greater pressure both on the home front and by the soldiers in Vietnam themselves to end this conflict. Okay? Let's move on. It says here that as the first U.S. troops were withdrawn, those who remained became increasingly angry and frustrated, exacerbating problems with morale and leadership. Tens of thousands of soldiers received dishonorable discharges for desertion, and about 500,000 American men from 1965 to 1973 became draft dodgers, with many fleeing to Canada in order to evade conscription. It says Nixon ended the draft in 1972 and instituted an all-volunteer army the following year, which is well and good, but the damage done by this draft, well, it can't be undone. Here in my book, America, A Narrative History, it says, Nixon's slow withdrawal of combat forces from Vietnam had a devastating consequence on the military's morale and reputation. Quote, no one wants to be the last grunt to die in this lousy war, said one soldier. Between 1969 and 1971, there were 730 reported fragging incidents. Now, what is fragging? Fragging is a process where it's the efforts by troops to kill or injure their own officers, usually with fragmentation grenades. It says drug abuse became a major problem in the armed forces. In 1971, 4 times as many troops were hospitalized for drug overdose as for combat-related wounds. What's the point being made here? The war is unpopular not only on the home front, but now among soldiers as well. Let's move on. All right, in 1970, a joint U.S.-South Vietnamese operation invaded Cambodia, hoping to wipe out DRV supply bases there. It says the South Vietnamese then led their own invasion of Laos, which was pushed back by North Vietnam. Okay, it says this is what led to the Kent State protest, as well as one at Jackson State in Mississippi, during which National Guardsmen and police killed a total of 6 student protesters. Okay, and we've already talked about this and mentioned this, so I don't want to harp on it. I just want to bring it up again now that we're moving forward with the war itself. This is, as far as the timeline goes, when those events happen. Okay, so let's move on from there. It goes on to state that by the end of June 1972, however, after another failed offensive into South Vietnam, Hanoi was finally willing to compromise. Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese representatives drafted a peace agreement by early fall, but leaders in Saigon, and remember that's South Vietnam, but leaders in Saigon rejected it, and in December, Nixon authorized a number of bombing raids against targets in North Vietnam, specifically in the capital of Hanoi. It says, known as the Christmas bombings, the raids drew international condemnation. Okay, and this is sort of one of the last pushes by the United States to end this conflict, right? If people don't want to come to the table for peace, right, we'll try to push the hand a little bit, okay? And that's what happens here with these Christmas bombings. Okay? All right, let's move on. Ultimately, however, by 1973, both the United States and members of the North and South Vietnamese, they've had enough, and it says in January of 1973, the United States and North Vietnam concluded a final peace agreement which ended open hostilities between the two countries. War between North and South Vietnam continued, however, until April 30th, 1975, when DRV forces captured Saigon and renamed it Ho Chi Minh City. Okay. Now, what happens in 1973? The United States leaves Vietnam in 1973. We have an agreement with North Vietnam that fighting will stop, and so we leave. Shortly after the United States evacuates Vietnam, the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong resume fighting, and ultimately, as it says here, in April of 1975, Saigon falls and communism overspreads the nation. Now, interestingly, the South Vietnamese ask the United States for help once the North Vietnamese become aggressive again, and the United States says, no, we are not going to provide any help. Okay. It says the long conflict had affected an immense majority of the country's population. In 8 years of warfare, an estimated 2 million Vietnamese died, while 3 million were wounded, and another 12 million became refugees. War had decimated the country's infrastructure and economy, and reconstruction proceeded very, very slowly. Okay? This was a long conflict that ultimately resulted with Vietnam being reunified, but under a communistic nation, under communism. Okay? All right, with that, I want to show you a picture, and then we will conclude this lecture. All right, what you're seeing here is actually another really iconic video, or rather photo. This is a helicopter which is taking the last of American diplomats and others out of Saigon in 1975 after Saigon fell to communism. And the very horrific part about this, and what you see is the desperation, is all of these individuals that are there going up into the helicopter, many of whom are Vietnamese, and they want to leave. And you know, this is like watching the Twin Towers burn down. You know, this is an iconic video of the last diplomats leaving Saigon, leaving the South Vietnamese to sort of have to figure it out for themselves. Okay, and you know, what does it say? A photo can speak 1,000 words, and that's why I sort of have tried to bring in some of these pictures. It's a sombering sort of thing. So, with that said, let's go ahead and move on to the last two slides, and we'll conclude this lecture. It says, in the United States, the effects of the Vietnam War would linger long after the last troops returned home in 1973. The nation spent more than $120 billion on the conflict in Vietnam from 1965 to 1973. It says this massive spending led to widespread inflation, exacerbated by a worldwide oil crisis in 1973 and skyrocketing fuel prices. Moving on. It says psychologically, the effects ran even deeper. The war had pierced the myth of American invincibility and had bitterly divided the country. Many returning vets faced negative reactions from both opponents of the war, who viewed them as having killed innocent civilians, and its supporters, who saw them as having lost the war, along with physical damage, including the effects of exposure to the harmful chemical herbicide Agent Orange. It says millions of gallons of which had been dumped by U.S. planes on the dense forests of Vietnam, as mentioned earlier. Okay, the Vietnam War was an unconventional war. It was fought unconventionally in many ways. We did not win this conflict. Okay. The last thing that I would ask that you do is there's a couple videos for you to watch on tunnel rats, as I mentioned before, as well as punji sticks. Get a sense of sort of how this war was fought on the ground. Okay. All right, guys, that does it for this week's lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Otherwise, go in peace, be warm and filled, and may the force be with you.